So, breaking news, a temporary ceasefire has just been announced between the United States and Iran. But before anyone can really breathe a sigh of relief, this deal is already showing some major cracks. Today, we're going to break down a pretty compelling analysis that argues this isn't peace at all. It's just the beginning of a brand new chapter in the conflict. So, let's get right to it. Is the war actually over? I mean, on the surface, a ceasefire sounds great, sounds like peace. But the analysis we're exploring today is, well, deeply skeptical. And as you're about to see, it's for some very specific and honestly pretty troubling reasons. Here's the core argument in a nutshell. We are not witnessing the end of the war. Not even close. We're seeing a tactical shift. The conflict is simply moving into a new and frankly much more unpredictable stage. So let's dive into the evidence. Okay, so what's the first major red flag? The fact that the ceasefire began to crumble almost immediately. I mean, the ink was barely dry on the agreement before reports of violations started pouring in. Not a great start. Yeah, the reasons for skepticism piled up fast. First off, the deal is only for 2 weeks. What's that? Then, just hours, literally hours after it was announced, Israel launched a massive bombing campaign in Lebanon. The U.S. immediately claimed, oh, Israel isn't bound by the deal. But of course, Iran called it a direct violation. So you have to ask, is this a pause for peace, or is it just a strategic timeout for the U.S. to rearm its allies? You know, this kind of skepticism doesn't just come out of thin air. It's actually rooted in a really long history of broken agreements and a negotiating playbook that, according to this analysis, has created some deep, deep mistrust. And understanding this pattern is absolutely crucial to getting Iran's position. Think about it. In 2015, international inspectors confirmed Iran was complying with the nuclear deal. Then in 2018, the U.S. just unilaterally withdrew. Fast forward to 2025, and a ceasefire in Gaza was allegedly violated by Israel with a U.S. green light. And maybe most telling of all, this current war, it began just one day after Oman reported significant progress in peace talks. From Iran's perspective, this isn't just history, it's a reason to be extremely wary of any new deal. So this all leads to what the analysis calls the art of the deal strategy. The playbook is laid out as this 4-step process. First, you make a deal. Second, you just violate the parts that are inconvenient for you. Third, you demand the other side adheres to every single letter of the agreement. And finally, when they inevitably push back or retaliate, you accuse them of being the ones who broke the deal in the first place. And the warlike rhetoric? Yeah, that definitely didn't stop. The analysis points to this threat, which was posted on social media by President Trump after the ceasefire was announced. It's just a really stark example of how the words and the actions were not lining up at all. This brings us to another huge fundamental problem. Nobody seems to agree on what the deal actually is. You have both sides telling their own people that the other side caved to all their demands, which is, of course, literally impossible. This creates a massive contradiction, right? If both sides are out there taking a victory lap, what is the actual foundation of this so-called agreement? The analysis argues that at least one side, and maybe both, is just not negotiating in good faith here. And here, right here, is where that contradiction becomes crystal clear. The reported U.S. demands are basically a complete dismantling of Iran's entire strategic capability. No nuclear weapons, give up your uranium, and support for your allies. But then you look at Iran's public demands, and it's a complete U.S. reversal. Remove all sanctions, a full withdrawal of combat forces, and they get to keep control of the Strait of Hormuz. These two sets of demands aren't just different, they are mutually exclusive. They can't both be true. And just to put a fine point on it, an Iranian official's reaction to the U.S. proposal was, well, pretty blunt. They described the demands as excessive, unrealistic, and unreasonable. That really captures just how far apart these two sides actually are. Okay, so beyond all the political mess and the uncertainty, there's another major consequence we have to talk about. According to this analysis, even if the ceasefire miraculously holds, a global economic shockwave has already been unleashed. This was never just about a military conflict. The key takeaway here is that the economic dominoes have already started to fall. The disruption to the world's supply chains has kicked off an energy crisis that is likely going to impact every single one of us, regardless of what happens next on the battlefield. This number, 20%, is right at the heart of this economic crisis. 20%. Before the war, that's how much of the world's daily traded oil passed through the Strait of Hormuz. Iran's control over this one single choke point gives it enormous leverage, and shutting it down has sent a massive jolt through the entire global economy.
And look, the disruption goes way beyond just oil. The analysis highlights that supply chains for natural gas, for fertilizers, which are critical for global food production, and other key commodities have been totally severed. The result is this huge inflationary pressure that we could be feeling for months, maybe even years to come.
And this isn't hyperbole, by the way. The International Energy Agency itself has called this the largest oil disruption crisis in history. That kind of language signals this is far from just a regional issue. It's a full-blown global economic event. So all of this brings us to the final and maybe the most critical point of the analysis, the argument that this conflict isn't just a crisis, but a catalyst. A catalyst that has fundamentally altered the strategic map and accelerated a global power shift that was already underway. The strategic outcome, as this source assesses it, is kind of a telling reversal. The U.S., after apparently underestimating Iran, was forced to the negotiating table. Meanwhile, Iran successfully leveraged its economic power over the Strait of Hormuz to achieve what it calls deterrence. A scholar named Amos Assad, who's cited in the source, frames this moment perfectly. He argues that Iran is creating a new strategic reality. It is redrawing the political map of West Asia. The key insight here is that Iran may actually be emerging from this conflict as a strengthened regional power, one that is actively challenging the old status quo.
So what does this all mean for the rest of the world? The analysis highlights three crucial implications. First, it demonstrates the limits of U.S. power, accelerating that shift to a multipolar world. Second, the UN veto from Russia and China, that signals a new willingness to check American actions on the world stage. But there's a potential dark side here. A U.S. that is blocked in one region may, as the source warns, double down on imposing its will where it faces less resistance.
And that leaves us with the final, pretty provocative question that this analysis poses. Does this conflict signal a U.S. empire in decline? Or does it signal the birth of a more focused and maybe even more aggressive empire, one that concentrates its power wherever it can't be challenged? That is the uncertain reality